Welcome back to the Daily Switch 2 podcast and part 3, the final part of this epic trilogy of treachery, covering the game keycard, 64GB card limit, and third-party sales dilemma for Switch 2. I imagine that many of you are coming here straight from part 2 because, as promised, I've uploaded this immediately after the second part, so I won't waste your time by reading the usual semi-obligatory generic podcast intro. We'll dive right in. I'll just say that if you randomly found this episode and don't know who I am or why I'm covering this or what we've already established and discussed, maybe check out parts 1 and 2 linked in the description and pinned comment, or don't. I'm not your mum. You can do what you want, and whatever you set your mind to. Have a very special day for a very special little man. Miss Cruzy. We're going to cover the 2 recent statements made by Nintendo about forthcoming price increases and doubling down on game keycards. Going to break down all of the options available for third-party devs and why none of them are ideal. We'll check out the wildly different approaches from several big publishers so far. I'll talk about my own dilemma as a third-party indie dev wanting to release physical editions. I'll provide some possible solutions for how Nintendo could fix the current problems, and then have a little heart-to-heart ending on a positive note about why we shouldn't get too bogged down in Liberty and why it's important to support independent art. I think it's going to be a fun time, so let's awkwardly cut into the part where I decided to split what I previously assumed was going to be one episode until it turned out to be too long for a single podcast. See you on the flip side. À bientôt, j'espère. Now, some people might think, well, maybe there's valid excuses for Nintendo phasing out the smaller capacity cards. Well, maybe if Macronics have let them know that they plan on stopping production of smaller capacities. But that doesn't seem to be the case, and they only did before when the costs came down for the higher capacities, like the 1 and 2GB sizes being kind of shelved when the 4GB became cheaper, so the smaller ones weren't needed. It will be interesting to see if Nintendo's own first-party games always come on 64GB cards, even when they don't even slightly need to, just to be stubborn. It's interesting that Drag X Drive is a first-party Nintendo game that they're pushing quite heavily, but it's only 1.8GB and they want to release it at a $20 budget price, so they're going digital only. I think that game will sadly get buried, and if they made it a physical release for $30 or even $40, a lot more core fans would be interested in picking it up. And if they would allow themselves, they could put it on a 4GB cart and make a lot more money per unit sold. But are they just going to be stubborn and say, well, we don't want to put it on a 64GB card, it would be too expensive, so we're just going to make it digital only, and a lot of our core fans won't end up getting the game? I don't know. But Nintendo are a rule unto themselves. They don't always seem to make logical sense, but what do we know? We are mere mortals. But me as a mere mortal and third-party dev, what options are there for third-party devs and publishers who want to release physically right now on the Nintendo Switch 2? Okay, now this could change, and I hope it does. I genuinely hope it does. That's one of the reasons that I'm making these videos. I'm not just complaining for the sake of it. I will offer some solutions towards the end of the video, just in case anybody at Nintendo happens to hear this. They won't, but just in case. 1. Your first option, release on a 64GB cartridge. Even if your game would have fitted on a much smaller capacity card, they don't allow it. It seems wasteful from an environmental perspective, and it costs up to $17 more than necessary, but you will get a boost from the people that want to collect only physical cards. As I said, only 3 publishers out of every single confirmed game for this year seemed to have chosen to do that. And only Bandai Namco would have managed to do it at a reasonable price, $50 instead of $70 for the others. Kudos to them, but it was for a mini-game compilation mostly aimed at children. I don't think the market would have allowed for a higher price. Nor would parents want a little kids game that requires an internet connection and won't instantly boot, so perhaps they kind of felt forced to, because their only other announced release so far is a more adult-themed game, and that comes on a code in a box, albeit at the relative bargain price of $30. We'll get to that later. The second option then is to release a Switch 1 version for physical collectors and then either a game keycard, a code in a box, or a digital only for Switch 2, but offer a free or very cheap upgrade for people that own the Switch 1 cart but want to play on Switch 2. This seems like a good solution, and it's one that many publishers are going for. But it's not ideal because, as we discussed in part 1, once someone puts a lot of money into buying a new console, they typically lose all interest in buying new games for the old system. Last part, I used the episode of Yoshi and Pooch's Woolly World on the 3DS, releasing after Switch 1 had released, for example. The Switch 2 is an expensive console, but every new Switch game bought by a consumer after buying the console makes them feel like it was a worthwhile investment. But buying a Switch 1 game might make them feel that they've wasted their money on the Switch 2 if they're still buying games for the older system. They want that nice new Switch 2 packaging on their shelf to see their growing collection. And at the moment, that's basically the only two options. There are others that would be possible in theory, but at the moment Nintendo don't allow them. We'll get to that later. But first, here's something I didn't predict would happen, but I really should have. It looks like Nintendo might be trying to discourage people from releasing games on Switch 1 and encouraging Switch 2 players to buy an upgrade. In the last day or two, Nintendo of Canada have put out a statement warning that Switch 1 prices will be raising. The hardware, the physical games, and even the digital games. Here's the quote. Pricing for the original Nintendo Switch family of systems and products will change based on market conditions. These include Nintendo Switch, OLED model, Nintendo Switch Lite, physical and digital Nintendo Switch games, and Nintendo Switch accessories. For now, that's only in Canada, but I would be willing to bet money that many regions will follow suit. Okay. Why? Let's get into this. Firstly, based on market conditions is a kind of weasel-worded way of saying because we want to and we're going to do it. Because, okay, you can talk about, not to be political, but you can talk about tariffs and you can talk about, economic problems and financial issues in the world and you can talk about foreign exchange rates. Yeah, sure, okay. But the key point there is physical and digital Nintendo Switch games and Nintendo Switch accessories. A large amount of those Nintendo Switch accessories don't have problems with tariffs because they don't contain electronics from the areas that are most affected. And the digital games, they're ethereal. They aren't physical. There's no import or export duties on them. Okay? So market conditions, that's bull. They're increasing the prices because they want to. So why do they want to increase the prices on the Nintendo Switch, the OLED, the Switch Lite, and the physical and digital Nintendo Switch games and Nintendo Switch accessories? Why? If the Switch 1 console price is higher, it makes the Switch 2 look like a better deal to people going in to buy a new console. And if the Switch 1 games are higher, it makes the Switch 2 games look less pricey too. And the two combined together discourages more new Switch 1 customers from appearing, thinking that it will be good enough and they could buy cheaper games. But more importantly, perhaps, it discourages the Switch 2 owners from buying Switch 1 games to immediately then upgrade. I've had several people, both in my comments and on Reddit, tell me that they've found it's cheaper to buy the physical versions of certain games from retailers who are selling at less than RRP, and then buy the upgrade to the Switch 2 version from the Switch 1 version, which they found cheaper. And by doing that, it's cheaper than just buying the Switch 2 version directly from Nintendo. And when you do that, a portion of the sale goes to another retailer when it could have gone to Nintendo. So, of course, Nintendo don't like that. Also, developers or publishers loudly telling people to buy the Switch 1 game and then upgrade it draws more attention to the problem, and it will make more customers ask why there isn't a physical Switch 2 version. It's just not a good look. And by the way, the price increases don't just apply to the Switch 1 because, quote, other Nintendo products, including Amiibo and Nintendo Switch Online memberships, will also experience price changes. So they include the cost of Switch Online service and upgrade pack, so even if you're just a Switch 2 user, be prepared that this will likely go up in price. along with those lovely amiibos, which you sometimes need to unlock certain game features. So many people, if you want the full experience on certain games, including Zelda games and including the upcoming Donkey Kong Bonanza as well, they kind of feel like you need the amiibo. It's almost like kind of physical DLC. So there used to be a time when Nintendo reduced the price of their games and systems over time. I know, crazy, what a concept. They even had player's choice kind of budget ranges after games hit 1 million copies, and they bulk sold classic titles to retailers so that people buying the system when a price cut happened could easily experience what they missed out on. The NES itself was re-released as a budget system with budget games as a cheaper alternative once the Super Nintendo launched, so people who couldn't afford it could buy the NES instead. And the same happened to the Super Nintendo once the N64 launched. Every Nintendo console before the Switch got at least one major price reduction during its lifespan, and many of them got several, some of them very, very quickly, like in the case of the 3DS. But now, the Switch 1 is going up in price after the Switch 2 comes out. Nowadays, it's not even unusual for Nintendo to actually increase the price of their old games, like removing the $20 Player's Choice Pikmin 3 and Tropical Freeze versions before re-releasing barely touched new versions for $60. They're evolving just backwards. So, let's look at what different third parties have decided to do so far and rate their approach. Sega have published 4 games so far, the 3 launch titles that we covered, and Whaaa Remastered. It's a Shin Megami Tensei adjacent title I'll be covering in my next episode that reviews the games from after the launch day through to August. They charge $50 for the base version of each game, except Puyo Puyo Tetris 2S, which is $40. But bear in mind that's a minor update to a game that Sega regularly sells on the Switch one for $20 or in a double pack with another game. Doesn't mean it's not an excellent game, by the way. Check out my full deep dive review on it. It just means that the price isn't as cheap as it might appear. But $50 then, that seems like a win against Nintendo's $80 games, and in some ways it is. But they were only able to do so by releasing on game keycards. Would people have been as willing to pay $60 or even $70 for Sonic X Shadow Generations to have the full game on the cartridge? Well, some core fans like me definitely would have, but when you consider that the full game on Switch 1 is $35, or just $30 on PS5, a current-gen system, that $50 already might look expensive to many, and $70 would be disastrous. Kind of harks back to the N64 days when multi-platform games were almost always $15 to $20 more expensive on the Nintendo hardware because of the cartridge costs, and that was disastrous for Nintendo in that generation. Bear in mind that for Xbox and PS5, the Blu-rays cost literal pennies to reproduce versus $17 for a Switch 2 cartridge. That's going to increase prices no matter how you look at it. On the Switch 1, the cartridge costs were a fraction of that, especially if you could fit your game onto a small cart, which would apply to most indie titles. Sega's own Whaaa is on a 16GB cart for Switch 1, but they either couldn't afford to or wouldn't eat the cost of using a 64GB cart for the Switch 2 edition. Unnecessarily, bear in mind. Also bear in mind that if released day and date, there would be pressure to raise the cost of the physical PlayStation and Xbox versions too, plus the digital version, because Nintendo have a history of not approving games being released on the Switch for more expensive than on other platforms, for example, mobile versions, presumably because they want to avoid that historical perception that Nintendo versions of multi-plat games are more expensive. And as we said earlier, they're trying to enforce their digital games costing the exact same as their physical ones. Another thing that I hate as a developer. For my own games, I feel like the digital version should be, pocket money prices, like maybe $7 to $15. But if somebody wants a physical version, I'll happily sell them one for $20 to $30. I think that's reasonable considering the extra manufacturing costs and things like that. But if somebody just wants to play digitally, I'm going to make the same amount of money if they buy it for $7 than if they buy the physical version for $20 or $30. So why not? It's just being greedy, in my opinion. The other thing that I must mention is the fact that it's $50 from Sega for the base games. Sega has a nasty habit of releasing digital deluxe editions, DLC, season passes, etc. So if you want all content, you'll actually end up paying far more. Sonic and Ride-Out both have Day 1 DLC and deluxe editions available, so the full price is actually higher than the $50 if you want the full experience right away. And there is some controversy surrounding the seemingly excessive amount of this tactic that's being used with their upcoming Sonic Racing Crossworlds game, with editions rumoured to be $90 or even higher. That's more expensive than Mario Kart World. I think these pricing concerns and the comparatively poor sales of their existing keycard titles might be why Sega have yet to announce any release details for the game on Switch 2, despite all other systems having a launch date and base price confirmed for the 25th of September for all other systems. I'm truly looking forward to this game, and I think it could be competition for Mario Kart World, so I really hope that Sega don't drop the ball too badly or try and milk the consumer's goodwill for the Sonic brand to recoup some of their perceived losses. It's worth noting that Sega are the third party with the biggest combined sales at launch, both physically and digitally. But this isn't surprising, really, given again what we've said about Nintendo's core audience leaning both family-friendly and retro enthusiast collectors. Most Sega collectors switched allegiance to Nintendo once Sega stopped producing hardware, and Sonic and Monkey Ball feel the most at home on a Nintendo system. But just because they sold the best doesn't mean they sold well. Don't forget that 21% of Switch 2 owners bought no games at launch. And out of those that did, 62% were first party. So while we don't know exactly who bought more than one game, we can assume that there's only a maximum of 30% or so of customers that bought a third-party title at all. And we know that Cyberpunk takes up a massive percentage of that because it outsold every first-party game except for Mario Kart. It's not a Sega game, by the way, but it's at least tangentially adjacent in my head because of 2K. So it's worth stating that Borderlands 4 is another major third-party multiplat not releasing day and date either. We don't know the reason, but these pricing decisions and the uncertainty as to whether enough copies will sell to even make it worth it certainly aren't going to be helping. Sega also don't offer any upgrade path if you already own the Switch 1 version of Sonic or Puyo Puyo, which I have heavily criticised them for, but apparently they will be offering that with Sonic Racing Crossworlds, which tells me that they know full well that it won't be releasing on Switch 2 day and date, and they're trying not to lose out on Nintendo fans' sales by encouraging Switch 2 owners just to buy the Switch 1 version on release and then with the promise of an upgrade later. This might actually be a strong tactic to increase sales because we don't even know the upgrade cost yet, and again, like Nintendo collectors, Sega collectors and especially Sonic collectors tend to double dip, so most will probably buy the Switch 2 version in full once it releases, even after buying the Switch 1 version. It's cynical, but it works, and I'm guilty as charged as someone who often falls for this when it comes to both Nintendo and Sega with their core franchises. Again, there's something about 80s and early 90s brands that have taught our brains to want to collect things physically like the old days, which is less strong for PlayStation and even less so for Xbox. You could slap an Atari, Coleco, Intellivision, Commodore, etc. brand on something, and there are a core amount of people that will just buy it regardless. I'm a little younger than most of those people, so for me that applies to Sega and Nintendo. Or indeed Capcom, Konami, SNK, Taito, etc. if it's retro-tinged. One of the most notoriously greedy third parties, EA, released a statement almost chiding Nintendo and saying that they had no intention of increasing their base price and following in their $80 game lead. Their launch game, Split Fiction, cost $50, and their announced Madden title is $70. The main difference there being that the cheaper game is a code in a box, ew, and the more expensive game is a keycard, slightly less ew, but still not great for $70. Neither is wonderful. Usually I'd prefer the keycard because you can resell them, but I mean, historically, there's literally zero resale for EA's yearly sports titles. We don't have a confirmation of the prices of FIFA, etc., but I'd guess it's the same. Despite this seemingly cheaper approach, EA takes Sega's lead and run with it by offering a staggering $100 version of Madden. For those crazy enough to pay that, anyway. Plus, there will almost certainly be microtransactions and loot box shenanigans. There always is with the new versions of these titles, and it will be the same for FIFA. Sorry, I've just remembered it's no longer FIFA, is it? It's EAFC or whatever. or EA Club Football or something, because of licensing issues. I wonder if anyone will have already corrected me in the comments from when I mentioned it before. Go ahead, it's all engagement. Go off, King, pop off. Other massive publishers, including Take-Two Interactive and Activision Blizzard, have so far only announced code-in-a-box titles, not even bothering with game keycards, and still charging $70 for the privilege. As have Square Enix, except for Bravely Default, which came on a keycard and may or may not have had publishing help from Nintendo. I confidently stated in part 1 and in my launch lineup analysis that Nintendo were publishing that game because it's literally what it said on their website before launch. But a commenter, Sarouj Gazarian, forgive me if I mispronounced that, pointed out that perhaps Nintendo only published the 3DS original and Squeenix are publishing the Switch version. And when I went back to check, the website had been quietly updated with no announcement, meaning that the information on multiple other websites was also now wrong because we all got our information from Nintendo. They also rightly corrected me that this HD remake is indeed a Switch 2 exclusive, although only exclusive remake. And the multi-platform title that I was thinking of was the sequel, Bravely Default 2. So sorry about that. And thank you for the correction. I apologize. Guys, if I ever get anything wrong, I'm more than happy to be corrected in the comments, and I will always admit the mistake, correct myself, and credit the person that left the comment. So please do. Thanks again, Sarouj Gazarian. In fact, while we're at it, please drop a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. This video is long and took a lot of research, and my throat is sore, so I really want the algorithm to see this video. It's totally free, of course, and it really helps me out. Thank you. I really appreciate it. So Bandai Namco, I already mentioned earlier in this video by putting out one budget game as a code in a box, but also having the distinction of releasing the cheapest current game that is fully on a cartridge in the form of Tamagotchi Plaza. If you haven't already, maybe check out my full review of that game, because even if you think you aren't interested in it, it's a quality little title, but more importantly, it tells us some very interesting things about the potential future for Switch 2, including future release strategies, region differences, the use of hardware features like mouse mode and innovative IR sensor use. I can't give them a pass for code in a box for Shadow Labyrinth. However, that game is only $30. And they offer a free update if you buy the physical Switch 1 version, which does come on the cart. You see, that shows exactly the dilemma that I was talking about earlier, and as I mentioned in part 1, it's the very same problem that I'm facing with my own games as an indie developer. For the titles that I make, hopefully really polished and high-quality experiences, but ones that I consider quite small and retro-inspired, I'm not really comfortable charging more than, say, $30 for a physical small print run for collectors. To me, that's the sweet spot, and it seems fair, following in the lead of games like Shredder's Revenge or Doki Doki Literature Club, that kind of thing. That price point is absolutely very possible when putting out a Switch 1 release. We've seen countless of them. But by the time you take into account the box, label printing, posting, import and export fees, warehouse stockages, retailers' commission, it's basically impossible to release a Switch 2 version for $30 using the $17 64GB cart. And even the slightly cheaper keycard is pushing whether you'd make any money on the sale. So, do I raise the price to $45 and charge the customers $15 more for Nintendo's mistake? I think people are a lot less likely to buy a small indie title for $45 than they are for, say, $30. So, I understand Bandai Namco's decision to release the $30 game as a code in a box, and I give them full credit for offering that free upgrade and putting out a Switch 1 version. Similarly, Hello Games didn't seem to bother releasing any kind of physical Switch 2 version of No Man's Sky, as far as I can tell, instead just offering a free upgrade from the physical 1 Switch version. It appears that Level 5 did the same for Fantasy Life I, but they charged just $2.59 to upgrade. I applaud both of them for not wanting to overcharge their customers, but I do wonder just how many more copies they would sell if there was a version in a nice Switch 2 box. It's either hurt your customers or hurt your own sales. Shout to user Jess Alexander Bunch 9599, by the way, who left me several comments saying he's really enjoying No Man's Sky on the Switch too, and had been playing for over a week when he messaged me and said it was a really good version. So excellent, I'm glad he's enjoying it. CD Projekt Red, of course, are the publishers of Cyberpunk 2077, and I've already glazed them in several videos, even separate clip too, because in my opinion they are doing it right, and even better than Nintendo themselves, by releasing the full game on the 64 gig cart and including a manual, stickers, and other nice little things in the package, which Nintendo don't bother to do even on their $80 games. And they include all DLC in the package and don't charge extra for it, which I still can't get over Nintendo trying to pull with Breath of the Wild. However, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't push back very slightly. It's worth mentioning that in the launch window for Switch 1, it was also only CD Projekt Red that utilized a 32GB cartridge, the maximum capacity for the Switch 1, and maybe the only third party to use one? I don't remember another one offhand. So there's one of two things going on here. Either CD Projekt Red are just super effing ethical and really strongly believe in releasing fully physical titles for the sake of preservation and quality, or they got some kind of deal with Nintendo to get the maximum capacity cartridges for cheaper or subsidized because of how much of an asset these true AAA critical darlings and hardcore gamer favorites would be at the launch of both consoles. I'm not a conspiracy theorist and I have nothing to base that on, but it does seem plausible. We covered them in large detail in part 1, but the star of the show is Marvelous, who have 3 games confirmed this year, including Rune Factory, Guardians of Azuma, which is out now. And all 3 of the games are on the cartridge in full, and the head of the company says that that's the plan going forward too for all other games, and gave exactly the same reasons and sentiments that I feel myself as a developer. And I found his words moving and inspiring. I'm glad that I'm not the only person who feels this way and is at least trying to keep the physical collector's ship afloat. However, I do need to make a minor correction. I mentioned that one commenter told me that Rune Factory came with a 31-page color manual, but I've had 2 European viewers, Casper Igas from the Netherlands and Gilater in Germany, both say that they bought Rune Factory, but it didn't come with a manual. I would speculate that perhaps this is due to the extra cost of translating and printing multiple manuals. It's a shame, but I understand. I still congratulate Marvelous for trying to do things right and releasing on the physical cartridge. And both commenters, by the way, stated that they are really enjoying the game, and after speaking to them both, I'm even more so very much looking forward to trying it out for my forthcoming full review. Make sure to subscribe for that one. But in the meantime, you have it on the authority of several of my viewers that it's a good time. And thanks again to you both for the helpful comments. However, with Marvelous, all 3 of their games cost at least $60, which is a good price point for the experiences they're offering and cheaper than $80 for Nintendo's top games. But as I said, for my own games, I prefer to keep the price to around $30, unless doing some crazy special edition collector's bundle that has like plushies or figurines or something. So how can Nintendo fix this problem? Because these are fixable problems. And this is why I'm making this video, and this is why I want more people to talk about this. Number 1 solution. Allow Switch 2 games to use smaller capacity cartridges, which already exist and are fully compatible with the hardware. So Nintendo can do this for free, for no extra work. They just need to agree to it. This is the best solution. But if not, solution 2. Allow publishers to use Switch 2 style packaging and Switch 2 logos on the artwork, but include an actual Switch 1 version of the game inside, which is compatible with Switch 2 and includes a free upgrade. Again, this wouldn't cost Nintendo anything to implement. They just need to agree to let their copyrighted logos be used in this way. For example, I'm thinking of that No Man's Sky release. You could just have the Switch 1 cart inside a box, but with the Switch 2 logos on the outside. Why not? And a bit of text that says this will run on Switch 1 and 2. This isn't such a crazy idea. Both Xbox and PlayStation have offered standardized packaging in the style of the modern consoles, but where the game will run on both current and last gen. It's an elegant solution that solves both issues. And as the Switch 2 boxes are the same size, we could even offer reversible sleeves so that collectors can decide if they want it to match either their Switch 1 or Switch 2 games. I'd love to do that. But again, sadly, it's only possible if Nintendo will allow it, because you can't just put Nintendo logos on commercial products without their permission. Third solution. If for some reason Nintendo knows something that we don't, and Macronics are stopping production of cart sizes under 64GB, which, by the way, is highly unlikely, but I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt, allow versions of your cards where publishers can insert standard microSD cards inside with adapters to interface with the SPI-like game memory interface. Sooner or later, an unlicensed third party is going to do that anyway. Sure, it's more vulnerable to piracy, but if you do it first, you make it less likely that someone else will do it, and your carts already have a lockout built in anyway. There was a rumor going around before Switch 2's launch that you could release slower cartridges with the game on, but which would require installation on the hardware, like the PS5 and Xbox games do. That would work, but that was predicted based on the idea that the reason Nintendo wants you to use 64GB carts is because they somehow read faster. And as I said earlier, that turned out not to be the case by much or even at all. However, there definitely are solutions to use older, cheaper versions of Flash-based ROMs based on older standards which do read slower but are much cheaper and could interface in with the SPI just as I mentioned. Or, number 4 solution, reduce the price of the 64GB cards. Probably they can't do that right now, but I imagine that this will happen over time as they become easier and cheaper to manufacture. And we can only hope that as the production costs come down, Nintendo reduces the amount that they charge third parties to use them, rather than just making more profit per unit. We can only hope. So one final point. There were a lot of people in my comments saying that they were refusing to buy a Switch 2 because of all of this, and the majority of them sounded sad rather than angry. Most shared that they've been long-term Nintendo fans and supporters, some of them since the days of the NES. I completely understand where they are coming from. Some of the decisions from Nintendo and their responses to criticism have been frankly very upsetting to me as a fan, and despite me really rooting for them to succeed, I really do think that they need to change their attitude if they don't want a repeat of previous generations' disasters. As we covered in part 1, just because a console sells big numbers in its first few weeks of launch does not mean it won't crash and burn in a short while, like the Dreamcast that tragically took Sega's hardware business down with it after only 18 months or so, despite literally breaking sales records left, right and centre in the beginning. Nintendo needs to learn from their past. And remember that the very people that saved their asses in the last multiple times that they've nearly lost everything are the very people that they are alienating right now. Many people in the comments said that they're boycotting game keycards and not buying them. And some might have the sentiment that this will teach devs a lesson and they will just learn to not release games on them. I mean, kinda. But I honestly think the lesson is more likely to be that they'll learn not to release games physically at all and go digital only. Or perhaps just skip the Switch 2 entirely, which, like previous generations after the NES but before the Switch 1, will end up doing untold damage to the console in the long run. Fine if you don't plan on buying a Switch 2 at any point in the future, but if you own the system or plan on buying one at some point if there's enough games that you want, I'd encourage you to think about buying them when there is a game that you want to play that just happens to be on a game keycard. Look, I understand the whole don't spend real money on fake games train of thought. Makes sense in a way, but that would also mean avoiding buying games digitally either. So by doing that, you're going to mean that you can't play what will probably be more than 90% of the games released for the system in the future. But if you are going to buy digital games and are just avoiding the keycards themselves, just consider for a second that they cost the same as buying them digitally, but you have a box to display and you can resell them in the future. By buying digitally, the only advantage that I can see is you don't have to insert the cart to play, but you still probably don't want to leave all your games permanently installed, as you'll run out of space pretty quickly. I don't know. I still hate them out of principle because of what they represent happening, but they're far better than digital only, and I understand why most third-party devs seem to feel forced to use them. A few days ago, at Nintendo's shareholder meeting, one of the shareholders basically stood up and asked a question about game keycards, saying they didn't think they were a good idea and would hurt third parties. In front of their investors and on record for the world, Nintendo very publicly doubled down on them. Quote, "The game key card does not contain the game itself, but rather a key for activation. A download is required when playing for the first time. It was adopted because of the internal storage capacity of the Nintendo Switch 2 is larger than that of the Nintendo Switch. We will make efforts to ensure that the third-party software sells well." End quote. Obviously that's translated and from an interpreter, but it's a complete nothing burger. Perhaps what they're trying to allude to is that for the larger third-party games that won't fit on the maximum 64GB of cartridge, they are useful, and they increase the internal storage of the Switch 2 to allow for large games to be installed. Although at only 256GB, you aren't going to fit too many game sizes over 64GB on them now, are you? The statement does nothing to explain why all the games that could have been on a cartridge weren't, because Nintendo are forcing the costs much higher and refusing devs to use cartridge sizes that already exist for Switch 1 and use the same technology, the only real difference being the colour of the bloomin' plastic. It's basically a politician's platitude response that doesn't answer anything, but they hope will sound good to investors that don't understand the actual issues that the person who asked the question was trying to raise. It is super annoying. But we're used to Nintendo being stubborn by now, and to be honest, making these kind of empty statements isn't bad, it's just business. Speaking of which, I had a handful of commenters who I won't call out here as I don't want anyone to harass them, but they were getting irrationally angry with Nintendo to the point of claiming that they're like the most evil company in the world, and one even saying that he's so disgusted with Nintendo that any developer who even puts their game onto a Nintendo platform should be boycotted, and they wouldn't even buy their games on another platform like Steam out of protest. Let's be realistic for a second. None of this is the third-party developers or publishers' fault. All of these decisions by Nintendo, not them. And all of them will have, just like me, been working on their games for many years, excited for the day that they can finally share it with the world, and they want as many people as possible to be able to enjoy them. As developers and publishers, we can't reasonably boycott Nintendo, especially not for those like me that are making games that predominantly appeal to Nintendo's fanbase. But also, evil? I really don't think that quite applies here. Greedy, yes. Short-sighted to the point of actual idiocy, absolutely. But if you boycott people simply selling games on a Nintendo platform because you think the company is evil, you'd better also boycott any publisher selling their games on Amazon, the shelves of any major supermarket or retailer, on the Apple App Store, Google Play, and definitely any hardware even slightly associated with Microsoft or Sony. What does that leave you? The Steam Deck, if using only the Linux Steam OS without Windows? Oh wait, I just saw that CoffeeZilla video about Steam profiting from getting children hooked on gambling. I promised another user that I'd try not to get political in my videos, and I don't want to, but you can't really go down this boycott route and still support anything that you may have heard of because of the current state of capitalism and the companies that allow you to hear of products in the first place. You should absolutely support small, passionate indie artists, whether musicians, writers, painters, poets, filmmakers, or, yes, indie game devs. Unfortunately, to do so, you usually have to use platforms owned by companies who sometimes do unsavory stuff. Heck, no matter what service or device you're listening to this on, you're doing so right now. And while it's tempting to get super angry at Nintendo because you feel let down by them, that's something I'm probably guilty of myself. It's important to keep some perspective on just how serious raising the price of Mario Kart by $10 truly is in the grand scheme of things. And yes, again, support indie artists. And if you want to support this indie artist and his indie podcast, be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe to the show. Check out all the links to support and consider joining our free members area where I'll be doing free giveaways of official Nintendo prizes, all at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. This was a very long one, so if you've listened to the end, thank you. Have a cookie. Next episode, we'll be back with the first of my promised many deep dives into Donkey Kong Bonanza. I literally can't wait for that game. It looks so effing great. Salut! Merci à tous!